All right, welcome to the next lecture in our Intro to Philosophy class. We're on a unit on arguments and logic and kind of basically the tools that philosophers use. And it's important that we learn these tools before we get to the interesting stuff in the course, as I'll explain soon. So this lecture is going to perhaps seem kind of dry and tedious. I've tried my best to not make it that way, but there's just some territory we have to cover today that will pay often dividends when we look at the fun material later on in this semester, which will be starting sooner than you think. All right, so judging the soundness of an argument can be easy in some cases and difficult in other cases. So recall what soundness is. A sound argument is an argument that is valid with true premises. It's easy to tell when an argument's valid if you know logic. It can be also somewhat easy to know if the argument's sound, that is, if the premises are true. So here's an example of some premises that you can easily determine the truth or falsity of. Suppose that me, Davis, believes that West Lafayette is in Indiana. Well, how would you establish that that's true? Well, that's pretty easy. One way is just to ask me, Davis, do you believe that West Lafayette is in Indiana? And if I said no, then you know that the premise is false. And if I said yes, then you know it's true. Here's an example that seems initially more difficult. So the premise, Davis has a brain. But this is actually kind of easy to determine as well. In principle, you could just stick me in an fMRI machine, which I think they have a few of them at Purdue. Or if you're a surgeon, you could open up my skull. But just take my word for it. I've had one. Well, here's a claim. How do we assess the truth of a claim such as C1? Davis knows that West Lafayette is in Indiana. Or claim 2, Davis has a mind, which is different from those first two claims. The first is that Davis believes West Lafayette's in Indiana. But then C1 is Davis knows West Lafayette's in Indiana. And then Davis has a brain. That's his physical organ in my skull. Davis has a mind. Claim 2, that's not the same thing. So these are different concepts. Knowing versus believing. A mind versus a brain. This is where it gets interesting then. Well, let's look at claim 1. The claim that I know West Lafayette's in Indiana. Assessing the truth of this by asking me is of no use. Unless you accept the premise that if a person believes a claim, that person knows the claim. And then assessing the truth of the second claim, that Davis has a mind, is of no use by opening up my skull, which is how you'd assess whether or not I have a brain, unless you accept the premise that brains are identical to minds, that they're the same thing. All right. Well, assessing claims like C1 and 2 and C2 isn't that simple. It isn't generally a matter of just looking or asking. Instead, we're going to turn to this tool that philosophers call conceptual analysis. And this is when we ask what is involved in concepts, such as the concept of knowledge or the concept of mind. Okay? So let's start with the claim that Davis knows West Lafayette's in Indiana. Well, if we're going to assess whether or not that claim is true, we have to first figure out what we mean by knows, or what knowledge is. So let's go through like an attempt. We'll say that believing something doesn't seem to be enough for someone to know something. For there's a lot of things that I used to believe, but I know they're now false. I used to believe that the sun revolved around the earth, for example. So knowing requires perhaps that you believe something. It does. But it also requires that what you believe is true. All right? Because we have plenty of false beliefs, but to know something, you have to have a true belief. You can't know X unless you have a true belief that X. So, the question is that enough? To know something is to believe it and for it to be true. Well, actually that doesn't seem to be enough either. For there are things that are true that you may believe, but you still want to say you have knowledge of. So, for example, my cousin believes that the Colts will win the Super Bowl this year. And suppose the Colts actually win the Super Bowl this year. It doesn't really follow, though, that my cousin knew the Colts would win. Instead, he had like a true opinion, a true belief. he's such a huge fan of the Colts that he believes that they always win, even when they don't. So he believes the Colts win the Super Bowl every year. So the years they lose, he has a false belief. So he certainly doesn't know that the Colts win the Super Bowl. But the year they win, all he has is a true belief that year. He got lucky. He didn't really have knowledge. So a true belief then isn't enough to say that someone knows something. So knowledge must involve believing something that is true, but also for the right reasons. And we're going to look at what knowledge is later in this unit. But that, for now, is a good enough definition. We'll say that you have to know something. You have to believe it. It has to be true, but you also have to believe it for the right reasons. Okay? So if my cousin knew the Colts would win the Super Bowl because he knew that all the NFL owners had made a secret agreement with each other that they would arrange for all their teams to lose when they're playing the Colts. So he'd have, privy to inside information. Then we could say that, yeah, he knows that the Colts are going to win the Super Bowl this year. All right? But that's not what my cousin is generally like. All right. So conceptual analysis, then, is an important skill. And a lot of what we'll be doing this semester, when we ask questions such as, does God exist? Is the mind identical to the brain? Do we have free will? And so on. We'll be doing conceptual analysis on, for example, the concept of God, or the concept of the mind, or the concept of free will. And coming to an adequate understanding of these concepts, God, mind, and so on, is crucial to answering these questions. If you don't have it's hard to give a good, serious, philosophical answer to the question of whether or not we have free will if you don't have a really bad definition of what free will is. So conceptual analysis is crucial then. All right, this is where I mentioned in the first slide. We're going to be looking at some topics that I think are a big damn deal. So if I was in the live classroom right now instead of just being a voice on a PowerPoint slide, I would ask my students, suppose that you're able to find out definitively today that God exists. And suppose half my students are atheists, half are theists, or I think both sides would raise their hand and agree that that is a big honking deal, okay? If an atheist found out that God existed, that would be huge. If a theist found out that God did not exist, that would be huge. So, yeah, these are big deals. It's the same thing with, do we have free will? That a lot of philosophers think that we would have huge ramifications for our justice system. But, it might just shake up your own understanding of yourself, too. All right, so, but to answer these questions, we have to learn conceptual analysis. Hence, this dry lecture today. Or we're not doing philosophy, we're looking at philosophical tools. But we got to get the tools before we can do the philosophy. All right, so conceptual analysis, though, isn't restricted to philosophical concepts. We also use it for common concepts such as abortion, pornography, and so on. In these cases, conceptual analysis can have legal and practical consequences. And what do I mean? Well, and when you do conceptual analysis, you're looking for an answer to the question, what is an F? And that applies to any concept. So, what is pornography? Well, you would start doing conceptual analysis. That'd be one approach to do it. What is murder? You would start doing conceptual analysis. What is equality? You would start doing conceptual analysis. All right. So here's a real-life example. Suppose the provost wants to ban all the pornographic materials from the library. Now, I'm not sure what college has, this porn section, but this was the example in the book, so we'll go with it anyways. But suppose that, there was this section at the library on porn, like the adult bookstore section of the Purdue Library, right next to the books on sociology and, just before the books on math. I don't know. Anyways, we'll just go along with it. So the provost is going to try to ban all these books. And the provost will argue that a particular book should be banned because it explicitly portrays sexual activity. So, in this argument, this provost has this implicit, presupposed understanding of the concept of porn. The provost thinks that anything that portrays sexual activity is porn. So the provost actually has this kind of implicit definition of porn, though. And the provost has in turn made this decision about what books are going to be allowed in the library based on the provost's basic understanding of the concept of porn. This, of course, all you smart students would say, that can't be right. This has got to be a questionable concept. I'm doubtful about it, because a lot of medical textbooks portray sexual activity. A lot of biology books portray sexual activity. And you notice how the provost hasn't even limited to human sexual activity. Ever watched the Nature Channel? So we wouldn't call those pornographic, though. So if we had to follow the provost's reasoning, we'd have to ban a lot of books. Medical, educational, biological books. So what we've done in responding to the provost is we've actually gone and done our own counter-conceptual analysis. The provost has this implicit definition of porn, and then we start thinking through what's wrong with this implicit definition of porn, and while doing that, we're doing conceptual analysis. And then we find out that the provost's definition is faulty for the reasons presented in this slide. All right. This is where we get to a notion that's perhaps difficult for many students to grasp, but it's important that you get it. And it's the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. So conceptual analysis of a concept F consists in specifying the precise conditions C1 through C3, etc., that must be satisfied if an object is to fall under that concept. And importantly, the list of conditions must apply to all and only objects falling under F, that concept. So I'm going to say this over and over and again, and my advice to you is watch this video, read the book, review these PowerPoint slides to get this. This is, well, it's easy to me because I've been doing it for years, but every time I teach it, I realize that for a lot of students, it's not immediately obvious what I mean by the all and only, by the necessary and sufficient. So we're going to explain it. All right. And we'll explain it by an example that I hope you all get. Take the example of a square. We want to offer a definition of a square. That is, we want to offer an analysis of the concept of square. Suppose we offer this definition then. For any x, x is a square, if and only if x has 4 sides, and the sides of x are of equal length. So that's our definition of square. Now, is this a good analysis of the concept of a square? Well, we want our definition of a square to be true of all squares, but we also want it to be only true of squares. We don't want it to be true of triangles or trapezoids or parallelograms, okay? So we want it to be true of all squares. We don't want any squares left out, but we want it to be true of only squares as well. So does this definition succeed? Think about it. No, it does not. Why not? Well, it does apply to all squares. All squares have 4 sides that are of equal length, but it doesn't apply to only squares. There are other 4-sided figures where the sides have equal length, but those figures are not squares. I've got an example right here. So importantly, when we do an analysis of a concept, that analysis must apply to all of the objects, but not only objects. Okay, let me rephrase it. So importantly, when analysis of a concept applies to all of the objects, but not only the objects, we say that the analysis is too weak. So this was a weak analysis of a square. And in fact, the provost's definition of pornography was perhaps too weak as well. Perhaps it does, remember the provost implicitly defines pornography as something that portrays sexual activity. Well, that certainly applies to all pornographic material. But it doesn't apply to only pornographic material. There's plenty of stuff that portrays sexual activity, such as medical textbooks. That is not pornographic. All right, well, let's try a different analysis of a square then. Let's try this. For any x, x is a square if and only if x has 4 sides, the sides of x are of equal length, the sides of x meet at right interior angles, and the sides of x are each 4 inches long. Now, is this a good analysis of the concept square? Think about it. Does it apply to all squares? Does it apply to only squares? And if you answer yes to either of those questions, then I mean, if you answer yes to both of those questions, then it would be a good analysis. But it is not. It does apply only to squares. All squares. Only something with 4 sides of equal length that meets at right interior angles that is 4 inches long is a square. But problem is, it doesn't apply to all squares. There are squares with sides greater or less than 4 inches in length. So that conceptual analysis fails as well. So we need an analysis, then, of the concept square that applies to only squares, but also applies to all squares. So importantly, when an analysis of a concept applies to only the objects that fall under that concept, but not all, we say the analysis is too strong. It's too restrictive. It leaves out too much. We don't want our conceptual analysis to be too strong or too restrictive. We don't want it to leave out stuff that should count as a part of it. Here's something important. Unfortunately, the United States has a tragic history with regards to a large segment of our population. We used to have legal slavery, and we used to have a really corrupt justice system that had a pretty good definition of a human being, is free and equal and worthy of all these rights, but a lot of legislatures defined it in too restrictive of a sense, so it left out people that were legitimately human beings, African Americans. So this is an example where a conceptual analysis that is too strong has horrible implications. In this case, African Americans got treated horribly. There are other cases where they had the right conceptual analysis, they just chose to ignore it when it came to African Americans too. So, but in many cases, it was a really bad conceptual analysis. Basically, only whites get to count as human beings. So that's certainly too strong of a conceptual analysis. So I stress that to just show that this is dry technical stuff, but it's important at the same time. And I'm trying to teach you to recognize and be good at this skill. All right. Well, how about this analysis of a square then? Back to the boring geometry. X, for any x is a square if and only if x has 4 sides, the sides of x are of equal length, and the sides of x meet at right interior angles. All right. I'm going to say it. This is a good analysis, for it applies to all squares, and it only applies to squares. Woo! All right. Now, I've been talking about necessary and sufficient conditions and its relevance to conceptual analysis. We're going to revisit some stuff that we looked at on the arguments lecture now, because this is part of the skill of conceptual analysis. So a conditional sentence is any sentence that has this form, if P then Q, where the variables P and Q are filled in with sentences. For example, if Frances is my aunt, then she is a woman. So you could say Frances is my aunt is a sentence, and Frances is a woman is a sentence. And then you could take those 2 sentences and plug them into a conditional. If Frances is my aunt, then Frances is a woman. That's what we've done. So any conditionals take that form then. Important then. The left-hand side of the conditional, which is P, Frances is my aunt, is called the antecedent. Latin, ante means before. If P, so that is the antecedent. The right-hand side of the conditional, Q, she is a woman, is called the consequent. There, it's the consequent. Okay. Be that as it may, conditional sentences can take several equivalent forms where sometimes the antecedent and the consequent will be in different parts. So if P then Q is one that we'll see the most often. P only if Q is one that I use a lot personally. I don't know why, I just prefer it. Q if P, oh, that's a bit different. It means the exact same thing as P only if Q and if P then Q. It's just that Q is syntactically before P in this sentence. Q if P, but that means the same thing as if P then Q. All right. So, oops, here's a warning. If P then Q is being a conditional sentence, is to be distinguished from what is called its converse, if Q then P. for they mean two very different things, and while one might be true, that does not entail that the other one is. So if P then Q then is not the same, does not mean the same thing as if Q then P. This is important, and this might show up in a quiz. And here's an example to show why. Here's claim 3. If Frances is my aunt, then Frances is a woman. Well, the converse is, if Frances is a woman, then she is my aunt. Why are C3 and C4 not equivalent? Well, while it's true that if Frances is my aunt, then she's a woman, it could be true. It may not be true. Actually, it is. It's just false that if Frances is a woman, then she is my aunt. If Frances is a woman, she could be my sister, my mother, my grandmother, my girlfriend, my coworker, or some woman from New Zealand, or any other woman. So being a woman doesn't mean that if a person is a woman, it does not mean that that person is your aunt. But if a person is your aunt, that means that person is a woman. So C3 is true and C4 is false. So that is why you can't just flip them around like that. Okay. So a necessary condition is something that is required for something to fall under the concept F. When we say that a necessary condition is a condition required for X's being F, we mean that if the conditions are not met, then X doesn't fall under F. For example, if being a woman is required for being my aunt, then Frances is not a woman. Frances cannot be my aunt or anyone's aunt. I'm sorry, yeah, if being a woman is required for being an aunt, and then if Frances is not a woman, Frances could not be my aunt or anyone else's aunt. So being a woman is in what philosophers say is a necessary condition of being an aunt. Now in a conceptual analysis, what I've listed here are necessary conditions. That's a necessary condition of being a square. If something is a square, then it is a necessary condition that it have four sides. If something is a square, another necessary condition is that the sides are of equal length. Another necessary condition is that the sides of X meet at right interior angles. So perhaps a necessary condition of something being pornography is that it portrays sexual activity. It's a necessary condition. This is what we're talking about. And it's required. Okay, so remember the argument form modus tollens from the last lecture? And you probably don't, so for review, it goes, it's this, if P then Q, not Q, so not P. So if Frances is my aunt, then she is a woman. Frances is not a woman, so Frances is not my aunt. This teaches us something about necessary conditions. What it teaches us is that the consequent of a conditional specifies necessary conditions for the antecedent. All right? So when you have a conditional sentence, if that takes the form of P then Q, the consequent is what specifies a necessary condition for the antecedent. So then the following would be equivalent, where necessary condition specifies a necessary condition for being an F. If something is an F, then necessary condition. So for example, if Frances is my aunt, then Frances is a woman. Frances is being a woman is a necessary condition for Frances being my aunt. That's semantically equivalent to something is an F, only if necessary condition. Frances is my aunt, only if Frances is a woman. Or necessary condition if something is an F. Frances is a woman if Frances is my aunt. Recall though, that is not the consequent. That is. That is also the consequent. Because these different syntactic structures, but logically they mean the same thing. Well, now that we've established what a necessary condition is, let's talk about sufficient conditions. A sufficient condition is something that would be enough for X's falling under F, or being an F. If the conditions are satisfied, then X is an F. So, for example, a sufficient condition of pornography would be, let's not go there. A sufficient condition for being a square would be one I gave back. Here, these four conditions combined, express a sufficient condition for X as being a square. If these four things are true of some shape, then that is sufficient for that shape's being a square. That's so. Let's look at an example. Being an ant is sufficient for being a woman, since only women can be ants. That's just a part of the definition of the word ant. So this is a valid argument. If P, then Q. If Frances is my aunt, then she is a woman. P, Frances is my aunt, so Q, Frances is a woman. Being an ant then is sufficient for being a woman. Being a woman is sufficient for being a human being. Being a human being is sufficient for being a mammal. Being a mammal is sufficient for being an animal. Being an animal is sufficient for being living. Being living is sufficient for being biological, I guess. But being a woman is not necessary for being human. Being a mammal is not necessary for being an animal. Being human is not necessary for being a mammal. All right. Sometimes it's best to just bombard you with examples. So here's another important point. The antecedent of a conditional specifies the sufficient conditions for the consequent. So then the following would be equivalent, where a sufficient condition specifies a sufficient condition for being an F. If sufficient condition, then something is an F. For example, if Frances is my aunt, then Frances is a woman. Sufficient condition only if something is an F. Frances is my aunt, only if Frances is a woman. Something is an F if sufficient condition. Frances is a woman if Frances is my aunt. Okay. Some more examples. X's being an animal is a necessary condition for X's being a dog, because it is required that X be an animal in order for X to be a dog. That is, if X is not an animal, X cannot be a dog. However, it isn't sufficient that X be an animal in order that X be a dog. X can be a cat and still be an animal. So being a dog is sufficient for being an animal. Being an animal is necessary for being a dog. But being an animal is not sufficient for being a dog. Because remember, cats and mice are also animals. So if we were to give a conceptual analysis of the concept dog, merely offering X as an animal for the analysis would be too weak. So an analysis that lists necessary conditions, but not enough to secure the concept, I guess, is too weak, as we recall. It hasn't listed enough necessary conditions. Whereas an analysis that offers too many necessary conditions would be too strong, if you recall. All right. X as being a dog is a sufficient condition for X as being an animal, because it is enough for X as being an animal that X be a dog. But it isn't necessary. X doesn't have to be a dog to be an animal. If X is a cat, X is also an animal. So if we were to give a conceptual analysis of the concept animal, then offering X as a dog would be too strong, because it would leave out too many other animals. We want a conceptual analysis of the concept animal that will be satisfied by cats, by mice, by humans, because humans are animals. All right, back to conceptual analysis. Recall that what the conceptual analysis of a concept F is. It's a specification of the conditions C1 through C3 that must be met if an object is to fall under that concept. We also know that if the conditions are merely necessary, then the analysis is too weak, and offering conditions that are merely sufficient generally results in an analysis that is too strong. What we want then is the exact right number of conditions that let in all and only F's. That is, we want a list of the necessary and sufficient conditions for being an F. So once again, the following are equivalent. Actually, let's go like this. So when I say all and only, I hope you have a better idea of what I meant by all and only. We want a list of necessary conditions that apply to all of whatever it is we're doing an analysis of, but we also want a list of necessary conditions that only apply to that. So once again then, the following are equivalent. If A, then something is an F, and if something is an F, then A. Something is an F if A, and something is an F only if A, and something is an F if and only if A. So we can and typically do shorthand the above as something is an F, IFF, A. Recall the square. We can say that X is a square if and only if IFF. X has 4 sides, the sides of X are of equal length, and the sides of X meet at right interior angles. Okay, now let's take a look at a historical example of some conceptual analysis. I had you read pages 1 through 19, the Plato-Euthyphro dialogue, where we get to see Socrates interact yet some more with some folks in Athens. So just some brief background real quick. The dialogue takes place, allegedly, before Socrates faced Meletus in court. Recall that Socrates faces Meletus in a different dialogue we read, the Apology. Socrates runs into Euthyphro, a young man who is taking his own father to court and accusing his father of murder. The details of the case are somewhat complicated, but fortunately, what's important for the purposes of this lesson is that the discussion between Socrates and Euthyphro that ensues. Socrates asks Euthyphro how he could do such a thing, charge his own father with murder. Man, I should host PBS with that voice. Especially when the person whose death Euthyphro's father is allegedly responsible for is not even close to Euthyphro. He's not a family friend, etc. And the person killed by Euthyphro's father was actually a murderer himself of a slave. So it's complicated, but it's also kind of, yeah, I can see why Socrates would be like, why? And you're taking your father to court. Why? Well, here's Euthyphro's response. Yeah, I am taking my father to court and charging him with murder for killing a guy who murdered a slave. Even though I'm not even... But guess what? That's the pious thing to do. So this is where the discussion becomes relevant to conceptual analysis. Socrates, being naturally inquisitive, in spite of the fact that he should be going to court, asks Euthyphro to define piety and impiety. So he's like, oh, what you're doing is because it's the pious thing to do? Well, what's piety? What do you mean? What's the pious then? Help me understand what it is. For if Euthyphro's action is actually pious, then Euthyphro can be understood to be doing the right thing. And if not, then not. Well, Euthyphro makes some attempts. Like many Socratic dialogues, it doesn't go well. And Socrates sees right through it. So here's his first attempt. He says, I say that the pious is to do what I am doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else, and not to prosecute is impious. There you have it. So Euthyphro's offered a first attempt at a definition of piety and impiety. Well, how successful was it? Well, at least 2 things. First, rather than define pious and impious, Euthyphro just lists a bunch of examples. Examples of a thing, though, aren't the same thing as a definition of a thing. And second, and in many ways, just a restatement of the first, Euthyphro's examples are just sufficient conditions for some X's being pious or impious. But in that case, if he was to offer that as a definition of piety, he'd be offering a definition that's too strong, too narrow, too restrictive. So it's sufficient, but it doesn't get all cases of piety and impiety. It just gets some, remember? And remember how a good conceptual analysis will get all and only. Well, this gets only, but it doesn't get all. So if piety is the same thing as taking your father to court for murder, then too many things that are pious get left out of that definition. Socrates is also dissatisfied with Euthyphro's first attempt. He writes, or he says, I should not be surprised, but you will tell me these at leisure some other time. For now, try to tell me more clearly what I was asking just now. For, my friend, you did not teach me adequately when I asked you what the pious was, but you told me what you are doing now in prosecuting your father for murder is pious. And he goes on, and bear in mind then that I did not bid you tell me 1 or 2 or of the many pious actions, but that form itself it makes all pious actions pious. For you agreed that all impious actions are impious and all pious actions pious through one form, or don't you remember? So when he says form, he means definition, conceptual analysis. That's kind of what we're getting at right now. Alright, well, Euthyphro has a second attempt. Well, what is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not is impious. Well, this is better. It's not merely a list of examples. It's not merely perhaps a sufficient condition, but it seems to be it can handle all. It seems to be able to handle a lot more than the first one did. Okay, but Socrates finds a counterexample to it. And we'll just look at, he finds several problems with the Euthyphro's second attempt, but we'll just look at one, and then we'll wrap up this lesson. So Euthyphro's second definition, when taking the actual Athenian gods to account, generates contradictions. Because what was dear to some gods was not dear to other gods, and vice versa. But if that's the case, then the same action would both be pious and impious, given how Euthyphro's defined piety. So, sounds like Euthyphro's definition isn't that successful. There are other problems as well that Socrates raises, but I encourage you to read it on your own. It's a very classic, rich, influential dialogue, and you can kind of work through it yourself. The dialogue doesn't resolve, it doesn't end with this, finally, with a good definition of piety, but it does show a number of bad ways to define it, and it demonstrates what pitfalls are to be avoided in defining concepts in general. So Socrates shows himself to be really capable of conceptual analysis. The end.